Ronald Danforth Plant Science Center, HEC-TV, Boeing, and the Danforth Center are proud to present Conversations, a discussion about the progress of plant science.
It's wonderful to see all the things that go on here. Now, to conversation. It's moderated, as always, by our very knowledgeable, wise, and beloved Professor Jim Davis. And the star today is our founding president, Roger Beachy. This center, as you all know, is here because our friend and our hero, Roger Beachy, because of him and his really taking a very vague idea and transferring it into reality. You all know his background and his scientific accomplishments, first to create a plant genetically resistant to a virus, member of the National Academy of Sciences, Wolf Prize winner, and recently honored by our own center, and so on and so on. I want to just add that Roger is a courageous adventurer. I wanted to say something new about him, and I decided that describes him. He came here to lead a plant science center that had no building, no endowment, no friends group, no annual support, and created something wonderful. Now he's in our nation's capital, and not just to establish a new entity, the National Institute for Food and Agriculture. That would be challenge enough. But Roger goes as I think we can say in this group, as a reformer, to change long-established customs, some dating back a century. The job is even more challenging because it may surprise some of you to know that not everyone wants to be reformed. So, one of the striking things to me is to hear the scientists say how glad they are that Roger is there, a real scientist bringing modern science to the department. So here is our adventure, visiting us in his hometown, and Roger and Jim will come up and just start out. Thank you.
I suspect most of you here have been to conversations before, but let me describe the format very briefly. Roger and I start talking, and for 15 or 20 minutes, it's a conversation up here. But then I begin to fade out of the picture, except to call on you. In the past, and at least in the recent past, we've taken written questions, but often at the end there's time for 2 or 3 oral questions right from the floor. Questions, please, not speeches, except maybe in praise of Roger. And since there's really one conversation, smaller and then expanded, if you have cell phones or other electronic devices, we really only want one conversation here, so you can click off the telephone. If you don't, I'll put it on vibrate or something. Well, Roger, there's a lot to talk about. Out in the preceding hour, you asked me what we were going to talk about, and I scratched my head and said plant science. From both your past perspective here and your present perspective, I was going to ask, what are the challenges? But as I thought briefly about that, I thought, as I started, they're sort of agricultural or biological, but then there are economic challenges, there are energy challenges, and maybe in getting people to adapt new food or new agricultural practices, there are social challenges. What challenges are on your mind? I don't really expect you to rank order them, but what are the major challenges you see today in plant science?
There are so many. We
have an hour.
Oh. Not according to Laura. there are the biggest gap, I think, is the knowledge that it takes to do everything. The knowledge that it's required to ensure that we have enough food requires that you know a lot about the organism, that you know about the environment, that you know about the linkage between what you eat and your health and well-being. The information that's required to meet all the needs that have to be met by these green things out in the environment, these plants that feed the animals or that power our cars eventually, that create all the resources that will drive our economy post-petroleum, post-old carbon. And we don't know how to do that yet. So there's an enormous amount that we do know, but the future to us is going to be different than the past, and it will rely on different kinds of information than we gathered in the first 100 years or 150 years since the Morrill Act. The Morrill Act was 150 years ago, and that established the land-grant universities. It's a pretty big year for celebrating because they've done so much for agriculture. But since that time, and we've implemented that well, but we're only now facing challenges that will really press the edge of knowledge generation. So I'd start first with knowledge and say we don't have enough of it.
And that includes not enough basic knowledge about plants and how they survive in their environment, never mind how they survive in a changing environment.
But we don't know how to make sure that we have enough clean water. I mean, as we till the soil and disturb the soil, as we harvest from our agroforestry, as we create new economies built on plants, whether it's algae, the little tiny plants, or tall trees, we have to make sure at the end of all of that we have enough clean water so that those of us in the cities have enough to drink and clean, and we leave enough for the agriculture that requires it as well. We don't even know how to do that.
But right now, doesn't agriculture take more water than we drink?
Oh, the numbers are pretty staggering. About 70% in this country, about 70% of the freshwater resources are used for agriculture. In China, they don't have enough water, and yet they're the growing mass of people. And so we don't know how to do that. We don't know how to save the soil. We don't know how to rebuild the soil so that it's more rich after we grow the crop than before we've sown the seed. I was at a conference earlier this week, and the reality is, that many of us forget, is that as plants and crops grow, it pulls out a lot of important things out of the soil, and not always do we replenish them. Comes to the zinc, for example, is now known as an important part of deficiency, and if you don't have enough zinc, your iron uptake isn't as good in your food. I mean, everything is linked.
But once upon a time, at least in this country, if land wore out, we just moved on to new land. But we don't have any more new land to move on to.
No. There is some new land out there. There's some land that's been treated badly. And modern agriculture is helping some of that to be remediated and come back in. And we've left a lot of land, what's called CRP lands, and some of our wildlife.
That's the conservation reserve, right?
Conservation reserve lands have been fallow, have been resting for a while because they aren't prime lands. There are ways to remediate lands that aren't very healthy. We're hoping that this can happen in Africa, that we learn enough about soil chemistry and soil biology to help to remediate those that have been damaged by what we now know as called sort of slash and burn agriculture.
But in this country, urbanization is still taking agricultural land.
Don't get me started. I mean, look when you drive from here west, where St. Charles is, what kind of river bottom land that was as absolutely prime agriculture land.
Both cities.
Cities are placed where they are in large part in the Midwest because there was good agriculture. And then we just take the agriculture land away and put up one house on 5 acres. I mean, how we use land may become an issue at some point. I don't think we can expect that government tomorrow will have land reform that will say land is sufficiently valuable for agriculture, we're going to protect it. But some societies do, and we're fortunate in this country to have enough land to do a lot of things, including hunting and fishing and golf and mini ranches. But maybe we won't someday, and we ought to think about whether or not we're making the best use of that land. There are a lot of resources that depend, that the growing economies and the growing numbers of people rely on. I mean, think about it, Jim, another 3 billion or 3.5 billion by the time we flatten out our population, and yet we only have a certain amount of land and a certain amount of water. We've got some challenges ahead, and it's going to take more knowledge.
For 2050, I keep reading that the world itself, the Earth, will have 9 billion, maybe only 8 billion.
Well, yeah, remember when we started talking about this 15 years ago, we'd said, well, 10.3, then 10, and now 9.8 or 9.2. Maybe it's 8.5, but it's still a lot more than we have now.
Is agriculture, is plant science up to that?
Oh, yes. I have no doubt that with the investments in the kind of science that's necessary, the kind of actions that have to come out of the knowledge that we generate out of science will do so. There are those who are very optimistic about Africa. We think of Africa as a basket case. But indeed, there's a likelihood, if there's investment and if governments have policy changes, that in 25 to 30 years it could actually feed itself and it be exporting.
But right now, is it the case that most plant science research is focused on crops grown in developed countries? Soybeans, corn, wheat?
Agriculture goes where the money is, not surprisingly.
Is sufficient money going to agriculture? Never mind right now whether it's going to Africa or Asia.
Whose money and what kind of money?
Well, what kind of money? I'd say hard money. And whose money? I divide it between private money and public money, public resources.
He's good. He defines himself now. Is there enough money going? The private sector is investing, in this country, private sector invests more in agriculture research than does public sector.
Is the private sector investing for American agriculture, maybe European agriculture, or?
Private sector is investing for private sector for the same reasons that you invest in drugs or in the next cell phone. It's important to keep the business going. So American agriculture is.
But let me interrupt, because when people invest in drugs, they're investing in drugs that will have a substantial continuing market, because that's where the money is. Drugs for relatively rare diseases, or diseases that don't happen in this country, diseases where there's no money to pay for them, they get shorter shrift from the pharmaceutical industry. Is agriculture that way?
Indeed.
We'll focus the research on folks who can pay for the food?
Yeah, this audience certainly knows the importance of investing in what we call orphan crops, or crops that are not heavily invested in, and that's what the public sector can do. But the private sector is helping in that regard, but they're really focused on their bottom line, as any corporation would be, and they're doing a great job. I mean, it's a proud day when you can say that of all the economy in the U.S., it's a little bit weak, as you know. But indeed, we've been so successful in agriculture that this year the export value of American agriculture is something north of $110 billion. And while we import a lot, we have a $31 billion export excess in agriculture. That's a fair shake. And for, as the Secretary of Agriculture says, for every $1 billion of export, we create 8,000 jobs. So agriculture is a big part of the success of today's economy. And our challenges, given the resources that we have, the land resources and the water resources, and I mean, we really are fortunate in this country to have this kind of natural resource. The question is, how can we ensure that in 20 years, in 30 years, in 50 years, that we have still the capability of having economy that is vital and maintains a vitality in our Midwest or in the crop growing areas. And that's what the challenge is, I think, for America's agriculture, is to project how to keep that successful in the face of lots of other items.
Is there some tension between exporting agriculture and helping other countries, regions, become self-sufficient so they won't need to import?
You know, a few years ago, Jim, that was a real challenge. In fact, I remember going to some meetings in this town in an organization that many of you know, and an individual said, you know, the way to solve the world's problems is that we grow as much food as we can and give it away and sell it around the market. We don't have to teach anybody else how to grow their own food. We can do it all. And that was less than 10 years ago. And it's absolutely changed in this last 2 or 3 years. Food security is almost equivalent to national security. And in this administration, the focus is on security of this nation as well as security of other nations. And the reality is that the Department of Defense, the Department of State, the Department of Agriculture, many have come to realize that that builds on economy that's built on agriculture. And that the more that we can do to facilitate someone else becoming a successful farmer in a developing economy, the stronger that economy and that society will be. The challenge is, how do we meet the needs? There are enormous needs in developing economies that start with just having enough teachers, enough extension agents, enough people that know how to select crops that are good for their environment. There's an enormous shortfall that has not been met either by European trainees of countries or scientists in different countries, or the U.S. involvement.
I was going to ask whether other developed countries are also sharing in teaching and in helping.
In two ways. Brazil, which is a very successful economy in agriculture, is beginning also to train and help in African nations. India, with its challenges to meet its own 200 million, which are underfed, are already beginning to train and help in Africa because the kind of soils and the regions are similar. China, as you know, is buying up an enormous amount of land in Africa and at the same time helping to develop an economy. Now, you can ask why they're doing it, and we know why. They need more land to grow their own food. But there are other countries investing. Europe is investing, but it's simply not organized. If you remember about a year ago at L'Aquila, where the G20 nations came together and promised $20 billion for the development of agriculture, sustainability, and productivity in developing economies. Less than $6 billion has been committed. Of that $6 billion, less than $3 billion is new money. So even though we promised $20 billion, there's less than $3 billion that's actually come forward. And $1 billion of that is out of the U.S.
And given the economic problems that a lot of countries are facing, not least ours, your organization probably doesn't even have a budget yet.
That's the other thing we don't want to start on tonight.
Where's there are a lot of non-starters here, right? Where's the money going to come from? The $20
I don't
billion.
know. I think one of the things that we let's deal with the U.S. issue.
Sure.
I think one of the things that we're optimistic about, we have to be optimistic, is that that's Congress as well as the administration both recognize the value of research. They value education. The issue of STEM education is front and center in a lot of people's heads and minds. The issue
STEM, science, technology, engineering, and
science,
math.
technology, and engineering and math. In Missouri, we call it METS. I won't say why, but it's the same. And so there's a lot of interest in education. There's a lot of interest in having America become equally as competitive in science and technology as it was in former years. We know that we're slipping behind. We know that the investments in other countries in certain topic areas are exceeding ours. We know that China has the largest supercomputer this year. It's larger than the one we have in the U.S. We know that we're slipping. And
well,
the question is, how
you
do
say we know that. I keep reading that various public officials say in this field or that field, we're number one. And when demonstrably, we are no longer number one. We may be 12th or 19th or 36th. So we've slipped. But is there sufficient public and the public's representatives, is there sufficient public awareness of the slippage?
Well, I think awareness amongst a few people and awareness amongst those who would vote and confer the ability to leverage more, create a greater millage for tax base, or the willingness to change substantially the investment in education is another story. And I think the challenges, we won't, I'm not an economist, I'm not a politician, but they are.
I thought you were in Washington.
That's really unfair. Yes, That's another, it's really interesting, yeah, it's really interesting to go from never having been in Washington, being in Washington and really thinking you can get something done, and really understand that it really is about, there's a lot of things that you can't do. So when we talk about the importance of science, especially in the plant sciences, which are so critical to our economic well-being and to our physical health, there's a lot that we focus on, and in my department, the focus on research has been relatively modest until recently. In fact, there are a lot of people in the department who know what should be done, but they think somebody else does it. They're surprised that we do research in the department. There's not a wide awareness of the importance of science in the department that is in agriculture, because it does so very, very much. And research is a small component of the total. So often when we talk, it's not what is the best scientific approach to handle something, it's what is the best policy approach, and so we're helping to change the attitudes across the department as well as across, we hope, across other areas.
We're about to move, I think, into the written question time, but let me ask a couple of questions. If you were advising a plant scientist just starting out in their career, what should they focus on? Where are the hot areas? Where may they have the most impact? What do you think ought to be high on their agenda at the start?
I'd start before they were scientists. I'd start and say that everybody needs to know the world, needs to have an appreciation for the arts, needs to know where they are in the context of a bigger part of life, not just in their specialty, and then place their specialty or what they want to become within the context of a system in which their specialty lies. For us, we talk about agriculture, but agriculture is really food, and food is really related to health. Health is really related to well-being, and with some luck, better health will reduce our dependence on healthcare kind of issues that the medical community is worried about. So really, it's agriculture related to medicine, as one context. There's also the agriculture related, of course, to the energy and other natural resources that we rely on. So as a scientist, I would try to find myself first in the context of where I want to, what is the area I want to contribute to? What are the things that I want to have impact on? And then find my niche, but make sure that niche is in the context of something. And that leads you to a different kind of involvement as a scientist. And when I was a postdoc, and I worked for a fellow at the USDA at Cornell University, and at that point they called one man and a belly to the bench. Every person was the scientist, and he stuck in his lab, and he did research that he or she was good at, and that was it. Today, science is way more teamship than it used to be. I often say from the podium in my speeches that science is a team sport. And as a team member, you have certain things you have to recognize. You have to recognize you can't do it all. You have to recognize that somebody else is smarter than you, that knows something that you don't know, and from which you can learn, and your science becomes better as a consequence. And if you have the right team, you might actually get something done. And I used that analogy recently at a lecture at Washington State University, and somebody came up and said, you know, the engineers have been doing that for 10 to 15 years. And then I talked to the new dean of the School of Engineering at Washington U, my friend Ralph Quattrano. He says, you know, the engineers have it right. And so we think maybe we should think as biologists differently, because we have some information that we know now, but we don't know quite how to get it out to use. The private sector does very well at that. But many of us in academic scientists, which I think we have consider ourselves at the Danforth Center, need to find, I think, this linkage between what we do in the lab and what we do in the greenhouse and what we do in the field and what it has to do with the farm. Of course, we have that. We're fortunate to have that at the Danforth Center through the international program, but because we started the center on the premise that we would have impact. You saw the impact of plant science on the human condition. Mm-hmm. That's the premise on which we founded the principles of the research of the Danforth Center. But I think increasingly that will be part of a successful scientist. It's not just what you know about the structure of a molecule or about the chemistry of a soil, whether it's sandy or loam or whatever it is. It's not just that. It's how that contributes to the bigger picture. The end result is an impact on people's lives or on the environment or on something that's tangible. And I think being able to link that together requires that you know more than just science.
Last question I'll ask before I turn to these, and you've raised the topic. Are we doing a good enough job moving expeditiously from the lab to the field?
We're doing as well as we can, Jim. What
Is as well as we can good enough?
Oh, no. I know the excitement that you feel when you invent, when you make a discovery, and all of a sudden it hits you. That might be useful.
Mm-hmm.
But translating that basic piece of information to something useful takes time, energy, money, devotion. Our friend Phil Needleman knows that well. I mean, the discoveries that he made with his fundamental work at the medical school turned into something that helps people, a medicine that helps. And very few of us have the opportunity to do it, nor do we have the nerve. And maybe that if we were in a different kind of a team setting, we would know what it takes to take that discovery to applications. And maybe if we're a good communicator, but more importantly, a good understander, have a good understanding of how it might be useful, and enough knowledge of economics, or a good friend that's a marketer or knows market analysis, knows how to pull that discovery into market, you finally get that connection between invention and selling a product that creates the economy of the future.
And not only in that market, but in that different culture.
Yes.
Because you have to break through tradition, cultural habits, ways of doing agriculture that father did and grandfather did and so on, and your lab finding may force a change.
It might, but I think at the same time we do that, as long as we're speaking hypothetically, the scientists really know what the public wants, and there are more and more that do. You have to have a feeling that there's a bigger plan. Right now our plan for agriculture is to grow as much as you can and sustain the earth as much as you can while you do that. But we're not saying what is the next thing that we should grow. What is the next thing that you would grow on this land that does more than feed hogs or create ethanol for the car? Because in the future it's going to be more than that.
Mm-hmm.
What is it that it should be? How do you set those standards? But more importantly, how do you set up a system or a process that allows discovery to be pulled in the direction you want it to go? There's a lot to be said about just serendipity and, well, maybe I'll invent something. But market depends, and you see invention after invention go by the wayside because it's worth having. It might not be worth the patent you've just paid $20,000 to invest in if nobody cares anyway. The mousetrap has to be for somebody. It has to be a mouse big enough or small enough. And so if you don't know the market and somebody doesn't vision the market, it's hard to know where to go. I was in a meeting yesterday with a group of us at the department. We had an inquiry from a laboratory in the Northeast that had discovered how to use trees, not just for how to use the breakdown products from trees. They extracted a certain percentage of it was being used for biofuels, actually for biodiesel and a conversion, but they had leftovers. And they were trying to decide what to invent the leftovers for. I mean, and there were good stuff in the leftovers. If you treated it right, it might actually make a polymer, like a plastic. And it's called, for those of you in the science audience, PLA, polylactic acid. But they didn't know if they had a market, and yet they were asking for a lot of money to discover if they had a market, instead of going to the market and saying, if I invented it, would you want it?
Sure.
And you really have to have this, you have to have a knowledge of what would pull a discovery in before you go to ask an investor to invest in it. At the same time, we've got the most conservative investing, we have a very conservative investing climate right now. little concerned about where the next dollar comes from for the new startup.
Could those leftovers have been used for cellulosic ethanol?
Well, they were using the main part for biodiesel.
Okay.
And then they had fragments that had a certain chemical structure that when broken make maybe 100 different molecules, and they wanted to search through those 100 and maybe they would find something useful. It's really better to know what you're aiming for.
Sure.
And so the knowledge of what the market wants should drive where the research is done. It's an exciting time because there are some serendipitous things that are going on as well that really are leading to new opportunities, and yet and they would be useful in the market, but still not enough investment funds that would help to move it forward.
Let me get to the written questions.
All right.
Agricultural land productivity has increased significantly over the past few decades, while at the same time the amount of agricultural land has decreased significantly. When do the lines cross, and what do we do about it? Now I'm trying to figure out the question.
I am too. Could you read it again, please?
Agricultural land productivity has increased while at the same time the amount of agricultural land has decreased significantly. When do the lines cross, and what do we do about it?
Yeah, there is concern that land gets used up and has to be turned back into CRP or resting land, and yet productivity continues to go up on the good lands, but there are some poor lands that had been distracted. What's what I want? Taken out of use, discarded because it was thought not to be useful, and some of that land is coming back into use. There's some good studies that have been done now, not in this country only, but in Africa as well, that have shown that you can take land that had been degraded, from which you could grow very little, and start all over again and replenish with chemical fertilizers, grow plants, and then have the organic matter enrich, and actually restore worn out land back to utility. That's happening now increasingly as we learn more about soil chemistry and soil biology and so forth. So I'm optimistic that there will be new lands that will come back in. The second thing I'm optimistic about is that some of the CRP or resting land that we have in this country will find a utility in agriculture for some of the biomass crops, the crops that will produce the new biofuels or that will be useful for timber, for biopower, that Ameren UE can co-fire instead of just using coal. So I think the intersection isn't as dangerous as we might think, because of the progress that's being made in lands that were thought initially to be unusable.
Because as I thought about this question, the way I came to look at it was that as land continues to sink, and you've assured me that we can recover land, but if land continued to sink and we reached the point we couldn't make the crop any more productive, it's as productive as it can be, then we would either have to stop losing land, or now your solution, we bring more land back into production.
There was a doomsday scenario a few years ago that said there is no more land out there. There's some other experiences now that show in recovery that we are more land. There is more land to be in that is tillable, that will be at least partially productive, and it will be sufficient. The land, I mean, if you compare the amount of yield or pounds or tons per acre that we grow in this country and yield in this country with our quality of agriculture, those in Africa are someplace between 5 and 10% of that number. Now, they never will be as productive as ours because they don't have the quality of the soil that we have, but they can be increased by 3 to 5-fold. 3 to 5-fold on land that's still marginal, and increasing to that level will feed a lot of people. So I'm optimistic that our knowledge of soil biology, our better soil biology, soil chemistry, and the knowledge of the kind of plants that will grow there, they might not be corn, but they could be cassava or sweet potatoes or other crops that will have value, that I think there's an economy that can be built on some of the land that we thought was not economically viable.
Will bringing used up land back into production require energy or petrochemicals for the fertilizer or other improvements?
Well, it's going to require some. Norman Borlaug and those that he taught focused on the importance of soil and soil quality. And he recognized far earlier than many others did that that was the root of success. So he never said that we can do this without using chemical fertilizers. There are those who would like to say it should just be on cow dung and grass clippings, but that's not going to be enough. And we're going to need, in some of these cases, significant amounts of investments, phosphorus and zinc and iron and magnesium. The thing, you have to know what the soil's like and enrich it. And when we run out of all of those things, that's the other doomsday, that we don't know how to.
Do we need a second green revolution?
We have one underway.
Okay.
Biotechnology is part of the second green revolution. I mean, that's helping us to get to higher yields. And biotechnology is a lot of things. It's not just genetic engineering, but it's really modern plant breeding, which includes knowledge of DNA sequence and markers to follow genes and so forth. But all of that is getting us far closer to the sustainability that we are looking forward to.
Your comment just now that we're already in the second green revolution is apropos this question. What kind of leadership role is the U.S. playing in world agriculture?
One of the realities of the organization that I work with, the department I work with, is that the Congress mandates what we do. And the U.S. Department of Agriculture is to create the knowledge and the practices that will create a vital and vibrant U.S. agriculture. It's not to enrich those in developing economies. And so the department's role, U.S. Department of Agriculture's role in training and helping other countries do things better is always in collaboration. Now, in the last 30, 40, 50 years, through different iterations of the philosophies of the U.S. Department of State and U.S. Agency for International Development, there's been different amounts of investments in developing agriculture infrastructure in developing economies, and that part is funneled through the agency that I head, NIFA. So our expectation is, Jim, that with this new commitment of the government to recognition that agriculture and its productivity, its economy, is key to social stability, is that with that recognition, we signed a memorandum of understanding between U.S. Department of Agriculture and State Department and USAID, the three, to funnel money through our agency and have contracts and grants awarded to universities across the country. So those universities then can make the partnerships with those in developing countries, and those partnerships then help to solve the problems that we've had that are in those countries. It's a difficult process. It's aid in a different way. There's an initiative called Feed the Future. And that initiative, started by Rajiv Shah, who was a person who attracted me to Washington in the first place and then went off to USAID, is responsible, his agency and mine are developing a research project plan that identifies goals that we together can solve. They then would fund some of the research that through our agency, and they would fund some themselves. Now, the question is, how do you know who to help? I mean, so that's put back to the target country. Let's say that country X once approaches the U.S. government for help. We have some criteria. Are you investing 10% of your GDP in agriculture? If you pass that hurdle, then let's develop a plan together to help get what you need done.
Do developing countries dependably have sufficient data to know what percentage of their GDP they're spending on agriculture?
What we've been doing in the past has been to share our aid in a different way. And we would go in and say, this is what you need to do, here it is, we'll help you, and then we leave. And we'll be there until your government policies maybe are not as comfortable with our government as they were, and we often would come and go. This time it's different. The difference is that we will make it available if you make these plans, and the best laid plans are those who have the economists, who have the surveys, who know where the farmers are, who know what's missing. Malawi has one of the poorest countries in Africa, $370 or $360 average income in US dollars. And yet it's got a country plan for agriculture. Nepal has a country plan. Bangladesh has a country plan. Rwanda has a country plan. So it's those countries that our State Department and USAID are working with to identify those challenges in those countries that would make a significant difference. We know what the hotspots are. We know where the areas of malnutrition are. They know what they are. They're identifying it for us. Now we become partners with their knowledge and our technology. We now are equal partners in solving a problem. And that's what's been missing in the past. And I think what this comes from is a recognition that we don't know it all.
Mm-hmm.
We're only as helpful as those that we interact with.
Where will plant science be in 10 years? I mean, we could talk about 40 years or 50 years, but 10 is plausible. What advances will have been made? You said the methane won't be solved in a year or two. That's why we're out to 2020 now.
All right. So what will be solved?
Yeah.
I think by 2020, the knowledge will be available to reduce substantially the amounts of nitrogen fertilizer that will be required to get high yields in corn. Or we'll know the right microbes plus fertilizer to help soybeans achieve their potential. And we will have enough knowledge of the genetics to perhaps see, there's some predictions of doubling the yields of corn and soybeans. That's perhaps a little optimistic, but I think we're going to see a substantial increase. That means that per acre, we're going to make more, which means we don't have to put as much land into production. Mm-hmm. I think that's a realistic one. I think also that by 2020, we will see substantial advances in converting cellulose and tree bark and from trees and grass clippings into valuable power and liquid transportation fuels. And I think a lot of that will be in the oil side, as you know.
Sure.
Whether it's algae to make the oils, or soybeans, or other crops, or conversion of the cellulose from trees through microbial fermentation into biodiesel. I think we're going to see great advances. I'm really excited about this field because a couple of studies that came from the Economic Research Service, that's part of that's a sister agency to ours, has shown recently that there are substantial economic benefits from ethanol as a biofuel, and it's not. Yes, there's a slight rise in food costs. There will be a 4 to 5 to 6%, but the amount of savings that we have in not purchasing foreign oil means that we send less dollars out of the country. So the benefits of the economics of corn and ethanol has not only benefited the corn growers, but it's reduced our dependence on foreign oil. That's a good thing.
But it might be an even better thing if our ethanol came not from a food crop, corn, but came from non-food sources like algae or cellulosic.
Well, cellulosic ethanol, and then next phase. Absolutely right. That said, there are so many uses for cornstarch. There's a plant that was built up in Iowa next to an ADM facility to make a biodegradable plastic from cornstarch rather than from petroleum. So it won't be just that we'll make ethanol from our natural resources
you'll make
corn
other products,
resources, but there are lots of other things to make.
Sure.
And as we learn more about converting not cornstarch but maybe sugarcane starch or from another sugar producing plant like cassava or sweet potatoes, also are very rich in starch, and you can imagine using those for feedstocks for these other products. You start to see an economy that's built to make the best use of our land and our water conditions.
We'll have a plant economy.
We'll have a plant economy, and I think green. If we don't find a way to use it, I wonder about in 30 or 40 years, what our crop lands will be producing, because as others know how to do this thing of making lots of food, we'll have other opportunities to use our land and our crops for different things. And that's why this bioeconomy. We all talk about a bioeconomy built on that premise that if it's green, somebody will buy it.
Sure.
But it's got to be more than just the cachet of green. It's got to have utility and meet all the other needs of the consumer as well.
It can't just be greenwashed.
No.
We're getting close to our witching hour, but let me try a couple of more questions. What can we as ordinary citizens, I don't think anyone here is just an ordinary citizen, but I'm reading the question.
By definition, you're here. You're not just ordinary.
What can we as ordinary citizens do to support your work and funding for agriculture?
Write your congressman.
As a political scientist, that's what I would have said.
I'm not a politician. I said that.
I understand.
What's missing is an appreciation in the community, in our U.S. population, of the value of what agriculture has meant to this country. We take a lot of things for granted. We take food for granted. We take variety of foods for granted. We know that we can import it from Chile if it's not here. We have this excess and the freedom of choice. In doing so, we've become very complacent about where it comes from. In the Midwest, we know where it comes from because you can't drive from here to Chicago without driving through it. But a lot of people don't know that. And without knowing the advances that we have made as intimately as we do in the Midwest, it's very easy to think that that's just there and you take it for granted. And I think the fact that we haven't invested in this science over the year, in the last 30 or 40 years, is testament to the fact that we've forgotten. You know, about 50 years ago, 40% of the investment in research in the U.S. was in agriculture. Today, it's a minor percentage of that, less than 1. So we've changed because we've become so successful. So I think once there's a recognition that global security rests on agriculture, sustainable agriculture, and societal stability rests on a full stomach. Dr. Borlaug said the same. I mean, if he didn't, and somebody of his colleagues did, you can't make peace on an empty stomach. You have to start with something. So that's important. And once we recognize that as a national security issue, secondly, that the economic security of not having to buy as much foreign oil and relying more on our own ability to fuel our power plants. Once we learn that we can't just keep pumping up CO2 in the atmosphere, that most of this has to be renewable carbon, reusable carbon, that we have to learn how to capture that in a way that is safe for the environment and really promotes storage of carbon. And if we don't do that, I don't think we will not have the kind of successful future that we want to have as consumers, as individuals, as a citizenry. And that message isn't out there. You remember Carl Sagan?
Sure.
Billions and billions of stars. How did we find out about astronomy? By Carl Sagan. How did we find out about agriculture? By Norman Borlaug. Where's the next Norman Borlaug? Where's the next spokesperson? Who is, and maybe it's all of you. Maybe it's your 300, 250 letters or whatever that go to Congress and say, this is important for American economy, American security, and by the way, for my health and my well-being. So there is more that needs to be said, and often the only thing that what Congress hears is how bad agriculture is. We do emit 31% of the greenhouse gases. We do. That's true. We we have been called the most destructive of human endeavor. We destroy more land, make more water dirty. That has been the past history. So a lot of criticism, but we still like to eat. So we've got to get it right.
No question. Let me take this as the last question. A great scientist goes to Washington with a vision for agriculture. How is he received?
Pardon? What was the last part?
What
was that last part again?
How is he received? A great scientist goes to Washington with a vision for agriculture. How is he received?
When I meet one, I'll tell you. I'm not a great scientist, but I did go to Washington. It's been an interesting year because I think for the first time, the science in the USDA has reached a different level. It's always been known as having some science, but it's never been visible. This secretary believes that it should be more visible. As a consequence of whatever, I know people in different organizations, and I've been able to make linkages between the USDA and the NIH that haven't been made as effectively in the past. The linkages with the National Science Foundation and the DOE have been strong, but they're growing stronger because they now are seeing that science in USDA is alive, it's real. And then the growing reality is that agriculture is so crucially important to everything we do.
I think that point can't be emphasized enough.
And the reality is that the energy departments, the health folks, the environment folks realize that much of the future success comes through a knowledge of agriculture. That puts us in a different league because it now emphasizes the importance of what we do. And at the same time, so that's the awareness is there. And the question is, can you capitalize on that awareness and say that we and then leverage that into greater support for the kind of research that's necessary to lead us into continuing our progressive agriculture, our sort of cutting edge agriculture into the future. Will we maintain the investments that are necessary to do that? And I think we have a chance of doing that. And I think part of my being there at the right time with the right people around has helped to lift the visibility of science in plants and agriculture. I get a lot of calls, I get a lot of criticisms, but we also get some kudos for what we're doing. And what makes a difference is when somebody who criticized you earlier now comes back and says, that's a good idea, I like what you're doing. And we're hearing that now. For the first few months wasn't as pleasant. So I think I maintain my optimism. I think the challenges that we face now, with the economic challenges we face now, make it even more critical that the voices be heard. Because if they're not heard, I think we will abdicate on our promise to help those in developing economies handle their agriculture. Unless their voices are heard, we won't have we will have agriculture as it is now, which is not as free and perhaps not as open in its economics as we'd like. There's still reasons to improve agriculture and the economics of agriculture the way we have our farming done now. And I think those changes are important to be discussed, and that the changes are important to the success of the next enterprise that leads to the future, and that's through research and development. I'm increasingly optimistic that as I go around the country, and that the young people who are attracted to the field come in because of their interest in the environment and their interest in food, health, and well-being. And the more we can bring them into an understanding that also includes agriculture, we have a greater chance of having a new breed of scientists, one that makes the linkages between the laboratory and people's lives, and will begin to have us more as a complete contributor to improving the human condition through plant science.
I want to thank Roger, and I want to thank you all.
Thank you. Thanks, Jim.
I'll add my thanks, and I'll add my thanks for Jim Davis, too. Let's give him a hand. So one can carry away from this talk a lot of wonderful ideas and things to think about. One thing I carry away from it is, isn't it amazing how much one person can really, in the right place at the right time, influence history? Thank you.